The hum of the Boeing 777's engines was a low growl, a promise of imminent ascent into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the night sky. For Grace Holloway, it was the sound of a necessary trial. Her hands resting in her lap were cold, one tightly gripping a small, worn wooden cross. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving in a silent, desperate plea for peace. From the window seat beside her, a scoff cut through her concentration, sharp and dismissive. A man in a suit worth more than her car sneered, praying if you're that scared, maybe you should have stayed on the ground. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know that her prayer wasn't just for herself, but for all 300 souls on this flight, including his own. He was about to find out. The air in John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 was a familiar, chaotic symphony. The rolling clicks of suitcase wheels, the distant garbled announcements of flight departures, and the low murmur of 1,000 intersecting conversations all blended into a sound that was both stressful and strangely comforting to Grace Holloway. It was the sound of journeys of hellos and goodbyes, of life in motion. She adjusted the simple strap of her shoulder bag and made her way toward Gate C-32. Her boarding pass for the overnight flight to London Heathrow clutched in her hand. She found her assigned seat, 24B, with a quiet sense of resignation. The middle seat, the purgatory of international travel. She was a small woman with kind, perceptive eyes that seemed to absorb the world around her with a gentle intensity. She wore simple black pants and a comfortable grey sweater, her appearance unassuming, designed to blend in. She stowed her bag in the overhead compartment, sat down and immediately began her pre-flight ritual, a quiet centering breath and a silent inventory of her own anxieties. Despite the hundreds of flights she'd taken, the initial moments of takeoff always coiled a knot of fear in her stomach. Faith gave her strength, but it didn't erase her humanity. The cramped space beside her was soon filled by the imposing presence of the man assigned to 24A. He was tall, dressed in a tailored navy suit that bespoke wealth and importance. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and a gold watch glinted on his wrist as he forcefully shoved a sleek leather briefcase under the seat in front of him. He didn't acknowledge Grace, his world already shrunk to the glowing screen of his phone. "Listen, Mark," he barked into the device, his voice a low, commanding rumble that made several nearby passengers glance over. "The deal is closed. Tell Harrison he can either get on board with our valuation or he can watch us absorb his market share by Q3. I don't have time for sentiment." He listened for a moment, his expression one of pure impatience. "No, I'm about to be in the air for 7 hours. Handle it. That's what I pay you for." He ended the call with a sharp tap of his thumb, sighing with the theatrical exasperation of a man for whom the world moved too slowly. He finally seemed to notice Grace, his gaze sweeping over her with a quick, dismissive appraisal before he turned to stare out the window. His name, she learned from the flight attendant who offered him a pre-departure drink, was Mr. Arthur Vance. He accepted a glass of champagne with a curt nod, already exuding an aura of entitlement that filled the small space between them like a noxious gas. The final passengers boarded, the cabin doors were sealed, and the safety demonstration began. Grace watched as she always did, her attention focused and respectful. The plane pushed back from the gate, its slow, lumbering movement a prelude to the violent grace of flight. As the jet taxied toward the runway, the engines whining as they spooled up, Grace's anxiety peaked. She reached into her pocket, and her fingers closed around the familiar, smooth contours of her small wooden cross. Closing her eyes, She bowed her head slightly, her lips forming the silent words of the traveler's psalm. It was a ritual of surrender, of placing her fear into hands greater than her own. A short, sharp sound pierced her quiet communion. A laugh. It was more of a derisive snort, really coming from beside her. Grace opened her eyes. Arthur Vance was staring at her, an amused, condescending smirk twisting his lips. "Seriously," he said, his voice low but carrying a distinct edge of mockery. "If you believe that stuff works, maybe you should have prayed for a private jet." He shook his head, taking a sip of his champagne as if toasting his own wit. "You're more likely to get that than to have anyone up there listening." The comment was a small, sharp stone thrown into the quiet pool of her concentration. It was designed to sting, to make her feel small and foolish. A younger Grace might have flushed with anger or embarrassment, but experience had taught her that engaging with such casual cruelty was like wrestling in mud. You only got dirty. She offered him a small, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes and said nothing. She simply turned her gaze forward, tucking the cross back into the warmth of her palm. The engines roared to a crescendo, pressing her back into her seat. As the plane hurtled down the runway and lifted into the dark, rain-streaked sky, Arthur Vance's contemptuous laughter echoed in her mind, a discordant note in the sacred, terrifying moment of leaving the earth behind. The flight attendant, a kind-faced woman named Clara, passed down the aisle. Her eyes lingering for a moment on Vance with a look of clear disapproval before she gave Grace a brief, sympathetic glance. The journey had just begun, but the air in row 24 was already heavy with a storm of a different kind. Once they reached cruising altitude, the flight settled into a familiar rhythm. The cabin lights dimmed, the seatbelt sign switched off, and the soft clatter of the beverage cart began its slow procession down the aisle. Arthur Vance, however, seemed incapable of settling. He was a man who thrived on friction, on being the center of his own universe, and ensuring everyone else orbited his demands. He complained that his champagne wasn't chilled to his precise liking. He spoke to Clara, the flight attendant, with a tone of voice one might use for a disobedient pet. He opened his laptop, and the aggressive clacking of his keyboard filled the relative quiet of the cabin. After about an hour, he seemed to grow bored of his work, and turned his attention back to Grace. "So," he began, leaning slightly into her space, his cologne overpowering. "What's a nervous flyer like you heading to London for visiting family, trying to conquer your fears?" "Business," Grace replied politely, her eyes not leaving the page of the book she was reading. It was a dense volume on crisis theology, but its cover was a plain academic blue, revealing nothing. "Business," he sounded incredulous. "What kind of business?" He gestured vaguely at her simple attire. "Let me guess. Non-profit work. Something charitable." The word dripped with condescension, as if charity were a hobby for those who couldn't succeed in the real world. "Something like that," she said, finally looking at him. Her gaze was steady, calm, giving nothing away. "I work with people in transit." His eyes lit up with a flash of understanding, though it was entirely incorrect. "Ah, a travel agent. Well, here's a tip from a client. Tell your customers that prayer doesn't upgrade you to first class." He chuckled at his own joke. Grace simply nodded and returned to her book, effectively ending the conversation. His attempts to belittle her were like waves crashing against a rock. He couldn't find a foothold, and it clearly frustrated him. He huffed, snapped his laptop shut, and reclined his seat with a jarring suddenness that likely startled the person behind him. He flagged down Clara and demanded a scotch, a double top shelf, before putting on noise-cancelling headphones, a clear signal that he was done with the world that refused to properly amuse him. 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over the vast black expanse of the North Atlantic, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. It had the calm, reassuring tone all pilots are trained to use, but there was an underlying tension that Grace, a frequent flyer, recognized instantly. "Good evening, folks. This is Captain Miller speaking. We're currently tracking a rather aggressive and unforecasted weather system that has developed ahead of us. For your comfort and safety, we'll be altering our course to the north to navigate around the worst of it. We are expecting some moderate turbulence, so I'm going to ask that all passengers return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts at this time. The cabin crew will be securing the galley for the next hour or so. We appreciate your cooperation." A murmur of nervous energy rippled through the cabin. Moderate turbulence was a phrase that could mean anything from a few gentle bumps to a bone-rattling ordeal. Arthur Vance pulled off his headphones, his brow furrowed with annoyance. Unforecasted. For crying out loud. What do they have meteorologists for incompetence? He took a large gulp of his scotch, the ice cubes clinking against the glass. The first jolt was minor, a slight shudder that ran through the fuselage. Then came a bigger one, a dip that made stomachs lurch. A glass slid off a tray table and shattered in the aisle. The fasten seatbelt sign pinged on with an insistent chime. The turbulence escalated quickly and without mercy. The plane began to buck and sway, not like a boat on gentle waves, but like a tool in the hands of a furious giant. The comforting hum of the engines was now punctuated by the groaning of the airframe as it fought against the violent air currents. Outside the window, flashes of lightning illuminated monstrous churning clouds that seemed to caw at the plane. Vance's confident facade began to flake away. His knuckles were bone white where he gripped the armrest. The expensive scotch sat untouched on his tray table, its amber liquid sloshing precariously. His breath was shallow, his eyes wide and fixed on the back of the seat in front of him. The man who commanded boardrooms and dissected business rivals with cold precision was in this moment just another terrified passenger stripped of his power and utterly at the mercy of the storm. For the first time since he'd sat down, Arthur Vance was silent. The descent was sickeningly abrupt. It wasn't a dip, it was a plunge. The aircraft dropped what felt like hundreds of feet in a matter of seconds, a free-fall sensation that tore screams from the lungs of even the most seasoned travelers. The cabin was a cacophony of shrieks, gasps, and the terrifyingly loud rattle of everything not bolted down. Overhead, bins flew open, spilling bags and coats into the aisles. A collective primal wail of pure terror filled the air. In that moment, there were no CEOs, no tourists, no students, no families. There were only 300 souls, suspended in a metal tube, tossed about by a force of nature that had no regard for their plans, their wealth, or their lives. Then the oxygen masks deployed, dropping from the ceiling in a chaotic tangle of yellow cups and plastic tubing. The sight so familiar from safety briefings was horrific in its real-world application. It was a tangible confirmation of their peril, a sign that the pilots were battling conditions far beyond the norm. Arthur Vance, completely unraveled. The mask dangled in front of his face, forgotten. His meticulously constructed persona of an untouchable titan of industry shattered into a million pieces, revealing the terrified man beneath. His face was slick with a cold sweat, his skin a ghastly shade of pale. His breathing was ragged, his eyes darting around the cabin, wildly searching for an escape that didn't exist. "Oh my God," he whispered the words, trembling. This is it. We're going to crash. He began to mutter a frantic, incoherent litany of fear. No, 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 I can't. We're all going to die. His raw panic was infectious, a virus of fear, spreading to those around him. Across the aisle, a young man in his late teens, couldn't be more than 20, was in the throes of a full-blown panic attack. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he clawed at his collar, his eyes wide with unseeing terror. His mother, seated beside him, was trying to comfort him, but her own face was a mask of fear, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold his arm. It's okay, Michael. Breathe. Just breathe, she pleaded. But her own voice was thin and reedy with panic. The flight attendants were heroes in motion. Clara, her own face set in a grim mask of determination, moved down the aisle, her movements practiced but strained as she helped passengers secure their oxygen masks, her voice shouting instructions over the roar of the storm and the cries of the passengers. Pull the mask down firmly over your nose and mouth. Secure it with the strap. Breathe normally, but they were hopelessly outnumbered, struggling to maintain order in a cabin that had descended into chaos. Grace watched it all, her own heart hammering against her ribs. The fear was a cold physical presence inside her, gripping her lungs, threatening to pull her under. Her own prayer was now a single, repeated word in her mind. Strength, strength, strength. But her training, honed over years of drills and real-world crises, cut through the fog of her personal terror. She saw not just chaos, but specific points of failure, specific people who were tipping from panic into a state of incapacitating hysteria. She saw the young man Michael, whose hyperventilation was becoming dangerously severe. She saw Clara, her face pale, moving from one crisis to the next, her resources stretched to the breaking point. This was the crucible. This was the moment where faith wasn't a comfort, but a command to act. This was her calling. Her own fear was a luxury she could no longer afford, while Arthur Vance, the man of power and earthly control, was being consumed by his terror. Grace Holloway, the quiet woman he had mocked, was preparing to step into the storm. She took one deep, shuddering breath, the recycled cabin air tasting of ozone and panic, and she became what she was trained to be, a beacon in the darkness. With a resolve that felt like an external force settling over her. Grace unbuckled her seatbelt. The plane gave another violent lurch, and she braced herself against the seat in front of her. Arthur Vance looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What are you doing? Sit down." "You'll be killed," he hissed, his voice cracking. She ignored him, catching Clara's eye as the flight attendant struggled to help an elderly woman with her mask. Grace spoke, her voice cutting through the noise. It was not loud, but it was imbued with an authority and calm that was utterly at odds with the surrounding chaos. "Clara," she said, her tone even. "My name is Grace Holloway. I'm an ordained chaplain with the International Federation of Civil Aviation Chaplains. I'm trained in crisis intervention and psychological first aid. Put me to work." Clara stared at her for a half-second, her expression a whirlwind of shock, confusion, and then overwhelming relief. The IFCCA was a globally recognized organization that worked with airlines and airports to provide spiritual and emotional support during emergencies. To find one on a flight in crisis was nothing short of a miracle. Without a word, she gave a sharp, decisive nod and gestured with her head toward the panicking young man Michael across the aisle. "Him," she mouthed. "He needs you." Grace moved with a fluid, practiced grace, her body automatically compensating for the plane's violent movements. She knelt in the aisle beside Michael, placing her firmly in the line of sight of the terrified young man. She didn't touch him immediately, knowing it could heighten his sense of being trapped. "Michael," she said, her voice a low, soothing anchor in the sea of noise. His mother had used his name, and Grace filed it away. "My name is Grace. I'm here to help you. Can you look at me, Michael?" His wild, unfocused eyes flickered towards her. "Good. That's very good." Grace continued, her tone unwavering. "You are having a panic attack. Your body thinks you are in danger, and it's flooding you with adrenaline. It's a terrifying feeling, but it is not going to hurt you. We are going to get through this together. First, we need to get your breathing back." She began to breathe in a slow, exaggerated rhythm. "I want you to try and breathe with me, Michael. A slow breath in through your nose like you're smelling a flower." She inhaled deeply. "And a long breath out through your mouth like you're blowing out a candle." She exhaled slowly. "In and out. That's it. Follow me." Slowly, shakily, he began to follow her lead. His ragged gasps started to lengthen to even out. His mother watched, tears of gratitude streaming down her face, her hand covering her mouth. "You're doing wonderfully," Grace affirmed. "Now I want you to look around. Name 3 things you see that are blue." The seats," he stammered between breaths. "The attendant's uniform. Your book." "Excellent," Grace said with a warm smile. "You are grounding yourself. You are here in this plane. I am here with you. Your mother is here with you. The pilots are flying the plane. You are safe in this moment." She then turned to the mother. "What is your faith?" she asked quietly. We're Methodist," the woman whispered. Grace nodded. She offered a quiet, simple prayer, her words universal enough for anyone to hear, but specific enough to bring comfort. It wasn't about deliverance, but about peace. "God of all comfort," she began, her voice a gentle murmur. "Grant us peace in the midst of this storm. Lend your strength to the pilots and crew. Wrap your arms around Michael and his mother and all who are afraid. Remind us that even in the valley of darkness, we are not alone. Amen." From his seat, Arthur Vance watched this entire exchange as if it were happening on another planet. The transformation was staggering. The meek, nervous woman he had ridiculed was now a figure of immense strength and competence. She hadn't just prayed. She had taken command of a situation using a combination of psychological technique, compassion, and faith to pull a stranger back from the brink of hysteria. Her actions created a small pocket of calm that began to spread. Other passengers, seeing her, seemed to draw strength from her composure. The scorn on his face was replaced by a look of utter dumbfounded astonishment. He had built his entire life on the belief that power came from money, from influence, from aggressive, ruthless control. What he was witnessing was a different kind of power altogether, one that was quiet, selfless, and in this moment, infinitely more valuable than his entire net worth. He had laughed at her prayer, and now he was watching as she became the answer to someone else's. The worst of the turbulence eventually subsided, though the air in the cabin remained thick with the metallic tang of fear and the lingering scent of spilled drinks. The plane was no longer fighting for its life, but it flew with a wounded heaviness. A new announcement from Captain Miller confirmed their situation. "Folks, we have cleared the storm cell. However, we did sustain some damage to one of the starboard engine sensors, and the fuselage underwent a significant amount of stress. As a precaution, we will be diverting to the nearest suitable airport. We have been cleared for an emergency landing at Gander International Airport in Newfoundland. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 45 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened. Gander, the legendary Canadian airport that had welcomed the world on 9/11. The name itself was a symbol of refuge. A collective sigh of relief, fragile but audible, swept through the passengers. They weren't saved yet, but there was a destination, a solid piece of ground in their future. Grace didn't rest. With a nod from Clara, she moved through the cabin, a quiet and reassuring presence. She spoke to an elderly man who was worried about his heart medication, ensuring a flight attendant brought him water. She helped a young mother distract her crying toddler by making funny faces. She simply sat for a moment with a woman who was traveling alone, holding her hand and listening as she spoke of her fear. She wasn't preaching. She wasn't proselytizing. She was offering a ministry of presence, a demonstration of compassion that transcended any single doctrine. She was a chaplain for everyone on that plane, the devout, the agnostic, the atheist. Her work was for humanity. When she finally returned to row 24, the man who sat by the window was barely recognizable as the arrogant tycoon who had boarded in New York. Arthur Vance sat slumped in his seat. His expensive suit rumpled his face ashen. The mask of superiority had not just been cracked. It had been pulverized, leaving behind a raw and vulnerable humility. He looked up as Grace sat down. His eyes filled with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just stared at his hands, which were trembling slightly. He began, his voice raspy, barely a whisper. I am so sorry. He finally met her eyes, and she saw not a trace of his earlier mockery, only a deep, hollowed-out remorse. The way I acted, the things I said to you, it was unforgivable. Grace simply looked at him, her expression patient, waiting. He took a ragged breath, and the words began to spill out of him, a torrent of confession held back for years. I'm terrified of flying, he admitted, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. Absolutely, pathologically terrified. My bravado, it's a shield, a stupid, pathetic act. His gaze drifted to the dark window. My younger sister Diane, she died in a car crash 12 years ago. A drunk driver ran a red light. She was gone just like that. Ever since then, I can't stand not being in control. In a car on the ground in my business, I can control the outcome. But up here, he gestured at the cabin around them. Up here, I'm powerless. We're all just cargo. It drives me insane. And when I saw you praying, I didn't see faith. I saw my own fear mirrored back at me, and I hated it. So I attacked you for it. It was cruel, and it was cowardly, and I am deeply, deeply ashamed. He looked back at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. And then I watched you. I watched you walk right into the heart of the chaos, into the very thing that was making me fall apart, and you brought peace. You have a strength I can't even comprehend. Grace listened to his confession without a word of judgment. She saw past the billionaire CEO and the arrogant bully. She saw a grieving brother, a man trapped by his own fear, lashing out from a place of deep pain. The hard karma he was experiencing wasn't a divine punishment. It was the inevitable crushing weight of his own arrogance collapsing under the first sign of real adversity. He had built his house on the sand of worldly control, and the storm had washed it all away. instead of the condemnation or the smug "I told you so," that Arthur might have expected, Grace offered him something else entirely, Grace. "Thank you for telling me that, Arthur," she said, softly. Her use of his first name was not an act of undue familiarity, but one of recognition. She was speaking not to Mr. Vance, the titan of industry, but to Arthur, the frightened man. "I'm afraid of flying, too," she admitted, and his head snapped up in surprise. "Every single time. My heart pounds on takeoff, and my knuckles go white in turbulence. This cross," she said, briefly touching her pocket, "isn't a magic charm to keep the plane in the air. My faith isn't an anesthetic that numbs me to fear." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a more intimate, confidential tone. "For me, faith is the belief that my life has a purpose, and that purpose is bigger than my fear. It's the strength that allows me to function in spite of the fear. It tells me that even if the worst happens, my call is to serve others until the very last moment. Today, my fear was very real, but the needs of the people in this cabin were more important. The simple, profound honesty of her words disarmed him completely. He had seen her strength as something supernatural, something unattainable. But she was describing it as a choice, a difficult conscious decision to put the needs of others above her own terror. It was a concept so foreign to his self-centered existence that it fundamentally rewired his understanding of the world. The plane began its final descent, banking over the dark, rugged coastline of Newfoundland. The lights of Gander, a small, welcoming cluster in a vast wilderness, appeared through the clouds. The deployment of the landing gear was a loud, reassuring thud, a promise of solid ground. The landing was not smooth. The damaged aircraft and the gusty crosswinds made for a rough approach. The plane touched down hard, bounced once, and then the roar of the reverse thrusters filled the cabin as the pilots fought to bring the massive jet under control. It fish-tailed slightly on the wet runway before finally blessedly slowing to a stop. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then the cabin erupted. Cheers, applause, sobs of overwhelming relief. Strangers hugged each other across the aisles. The shared trauma had forged a temporary, powerful bond among them all. As they waited for the emergency vehicles to approach and for the stairs to be brought to the aircraft, Arthur Vance sat quietly amidst the celebration. He turned to Grace, his face a canvas of complex emotions. "You were praying for us," he stated, his voice full of a newfound reverence. "At the very beginning, before we ever took off, you were praying for this flight." Grace met his gaze and gave a small, simple nod. "And I was laughing," he said, the words heavy with the full weight of his folly. The karmic irony of the situation settled upon him not as a punishment, but as a profound and humbling lesson. In his arrogance, he had mocked the very thing that the entire plane, himself included, would come to desperately need a sliver of grace in the face of oblivion. He had scoffed at her plea for a safe journey, only to have his own life depend on the skill of the crew and the unshakable calm of the woman he had tried so hard to diminish. The transition from the violent, groaning chaos of the sky to the profound stillness of the tarmac was a sensory shock. As the plane's engines spooled down into a final exhausted whine, a silence fell over the cabin that was deeper and more absolute than any Arthur Vance had ever experienced. It was the silence of held breaths of prayers, answered of 300 souls collectively realizing they were alive. The emergency exit doors were opened, and the first wave of cold, clean Newfoundland air swept through the aircraft, smelling of pine-damp earth and the faint metallic tang of rain. It was the most beautiful scent he had ever known. Deplaning was a slow, surreal affair. There was no jostling for position, no impatient grabbing of overhead luggage. People moved with a quiet, dazed reverence, helping one another, offering a steadying hand or a whispered word of comfort. They descended the mobile stairs not as individual travelers, but as a single, traumatized body, blinking against the flashing red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles that surrounded their wounded metal bird like concerned sentinels. Arthur stepped onto the tarmac, and his expensive leather-soled shoes, usually accustomed to polished marble floors and plush carpets, felt unsteady on the rough, damp asphalt. He looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky, a sky that only an hour ago had been a black, boiling cauldron of terror. He took a breath, and then another, filling his lungs with the grounding reality of being on the earth. He was alive. The simple biological fact of it was so overwhelming that his knees felt weak. Around him, the emotional dam broke. A woman began to sob openly, her body shaking with the delayed shock. A family huddled together in a tight, desperate embrace. A man laughed, a wild, unhinged sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Arthur, however, felt nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness. He was a man who defined himself by his actions, his decisions, his control. For the past several hours, he had been nothing but a passive, terrified spectator to his own potential demise. Now on the ground, he felt like a ghost, an observer in his own life. He watched as the ground crew and airport personnel moved with practiced efficiency, their calm professionalism a stark contrast to the raw emotion of the passengers. They were a part of a system that worked, a system he had never once stopped to appreciate. He was herded with the others towards the terminal, a modest, low-slung building that glowed with a welcoming yellow light in the vast darkness. The sign read Gander International Airport, and for these weary travelers, it might as well have been the gates of heaven. Inside, the warmth was immediate and enveloping. The space was not a sprawling, impersonal hub like JFK. It was small, intimate, and utterly human. A team was waiting for them. Not just officials, but townspeople. Volunteers in Red Cross vests, their faces etched with genuine concern. They handed out thick woolen blankets, steaming cups of coffee and sandwiches on simple white bread. It was not gourmet catering. It was sustenance offered with a kindness so genuine it was almost jarring to Arthur's transactional worldview. No one wanted anything from him. No one was trying to sell him anything or impress him. They were simply helping because people were in need. He took a blanket and a cup of coffee, the cheap styrofoam cup warming his trembling hands. He found an unoccupied corner away from the main throng of people and simply stood observing. He watched the organized chaos of survival. Paramedics were attending to a few passengers who had suffered minor injuries. Airline representatives were trying to sort out the monumental logistical nightmare of accommodation and onward travel. But mostly he watched the passengers. He saw a young backpacker lend his phone to an elderly woman so she could call her family. He saw Michael, the young man from across the aisle, now sitting quietly with his mother, sipping a hot chocolate, his earlier panic replaced by a fragile calm. And then he saw Grace. She was not resting. She was not on the phone, reassuring her own loved ones. Her work, he realized with a jolt, had not ended when the plane landed. She had moved from crisis intervention in the air to pastoral care on the ground. She stood with a small group of the flight crew, including Clara and the co-pilot. Their professional masks had crumbled, and she was listening, her head tilted with empathy as they recounted the terror from their perspective in the cockpit and the cabin. She wasn't offering platitudes. She was validating their fear, honoring their professionalism, and providing a safe space for them to begin to decompress. She was a chaplain not just for the passengers, but for all who had endured the ordeal. Arthur watched her move from that group to another. A businessman, his suit just as expensive as Arthur's, was staring blankly at a wall, his phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. He had been on his way to close a deal, he was saying to no one in particular, a multi-million-dollar merger. Now he couldn't remember what any of it was for. Grace approached him not with words, but with a second cup of coffee. She simply stood beside him, her presence a silent offering of solidarity. After a long moment, the man began to speak, his voice thick with emotion, and she listened, her full attention a gift. This was her power, Arthur realized. It wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't demand attention or command a room through intimidation. It was a quiet, gravitational force. A power built on empathy, on listening, on seeing the humanity in others when they were at their most vulnerable. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of wealth and influence around himself to keep vulnerability at bay. He saw other people's weaknesses as opportunities, their fears as leverage. Grace walked toward the pain, into the heart of the fear, and she didn't just withstand it. She absorbed it, soothed it, and transformed it into a moment of human connection. A profound, burning shame washed over him, so intense it felt like a physical fever. He replayed the scene at the beginning of the flight in his mind, his own words echoing with a new, horrifying clarity. "If you're that scared, maybe you should have stayed on the ground. Prayer doesn't upgrade you to first class." He had been a caricature of a bully, a cheap villain in a story far more profound than he could have imagined. He had mocked her faith, but what he had really been mocking was her compassion, her humility, her strength, all the qualities he so spectacularly lacked. The karma of the situation was almost poetic in its cruelty. His greatest fear had been realized, and in that moment of ultimate powerlessness, the worldly assets he valued so highly had been rendered utterly worthless. His 9-figure net worth couldn't level the plane. His high-powered connections couldn't calm the storm. His aggressive personality couldn't intimidate the laws of physics. All the armor he had so carefully constructed had been stripped away, leaving him just as naked and terrified as everyone else. And the person who had shown the most strength, the most grace under pressure, was the very person he had chosen as the target of his contempt. He thought of his sister Diane. He had honored her memory by becoming a control freak, by building an empire so vast and powerful that he would never again feel the helpless grief he felt on the day she died. But had he truly honored her, Diane had been like Grace. Kind, compassionate, a volunteer at the local animal shelter, a woman who found joy in small, simple things. She would have been horrified by the man he had become. In trying to armor himself against the pain of her loss, he had walled off the very parts of himself that were most like her. He wasn't just afraid of flying. He was afraid of living in a world he couldn't control. He was afraid of being vulnerable, of being human. He had to speak to her. It wasn't just about apologizing anymore. An apology felt insufficient, a paltry gesture in the face of the seismic shift that had occurred within him. He needed to understand. He wasn't sure what he needed, but he knew he couldn't leave this airport, this strange purgatory in the middle of nowhere, without speaking to her one more time. He watched as Captain Miller, a man who had literally held all their lives in his hands, approached Grace. Arthur expected a formal professional exchange. Instead, the captain, a man with silver hair and decades of experience etched into the lines around his eyes, took both of her hands in his. "Chaplain," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended mere gratitude. "I've been flying for 35 years. I've seen a lot. I have never ever seen anything like what you did up there tonight." The cabin was on the verge of total panic. We could hear it through the cockpit door. "That's a dangerous situation. It can distract the crew, lead to injuries. You were a second command center back there. A command center for the human soul. I don't know what we would have done without you." "Thank you." Grace simply nodded, accepting his words with a quiet humility that Arthur was beginning to understand was not a sign of meekness, but of profound self-assurance. She didn't need praise to validate her work. The work was its own validation. He finally gathered the tattered remnants of his courage. He smoothed down his wrinkled suit, a futile gesture of returning to his old self that felt utterly ridiculous. He walked across the bustling terminal floor, each step feeling like a mile. The conversations, the crying, the logistical announcements, it all faded into a dull roar as he focused on the small, unassuming woman in the grey sweater. She saw him coming. There was no surprise in her eyes, no animosity, no hint of smug satisfaction. Her expression was one of patient expectation, as if she knew this conversation was an inevitable part of the journey. He stopped a few feet away from her, unsure of how to even begin. The words, "I'm sorry," died on his lips. They were too small for the magnitude of his transgression. "Grace," he began, and the sound of her name in his own voice felt foreign. He had never spoken it before. "I've been standing over there watching you, watching what you do. I've spent my entire life building things. Companies, fortunes, a reputation. I measure success in dollars and acquisitions. And tonight I realized I haven't built anything that truly matters." He took a shaky breath, the confession feeling like a physical weight being lifted from his chest. "I saw more value, more genuine power in the way you comforted that young man, Michael, than I've seen in any boardroom. I saw more strength in the way you listened to the crew than I've ever wielded in a hostile takeover. You showed me what real strength is, and it has nothing to do with control or money, and I am so profoundly ashamed of how I treated you." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, his hand closing around the familiar crisp rectangle of his business card. It felt like an artifact from another life. "This is my private number," he said, holding it out to her. It was not a gesture of power, but an offering. "My company has a charitable foundation. It's mostly been a sham, if I'm being honest. A tool for tax write-offs and public relations. A way to look good while doing the bare minimum." He shook his head, the self-loathing clear in his voice. "I want to change that. I want it to mean something. I want to make a substantial multi-year donation to the International Federation of Civil Aviation Chaplains. I don't just mean a check. I mean a real endowment. Enough to ensure people with your skills, your spirit are on more flights in more airports. People need this. They need you. Even arrogant fools like me, who are too blind to see it until they're falling out of the sky." Grace looked at the card in his hand, then back to his eyes. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his, and the simple human contact sent a jolt through him. She studied the card for a moment, the embossed name. the title, the symbols of his earthly kingdom. Then she met his gaze, and her eyes were filled with a deep, compassionate wisdom. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This is a generous and honorable offer, and I can promise you that your help will do a great deal of good. It will provide training resources and support that will touch thousands of lives." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "But this," she said, holding up the card, "is the easy part for you. Writing a check is what you know how to do. It's a powerful tool, but it's not the ultimate answer." She took a step closer, and her voice dropped, becoming more intimate. "The most important donation you can make won't be with your money. The real change, the one that will truly honor what you've learned tonight, has to happen here." She gently tapped her own chest over her heart. "Be kind when no one is watching. Be humble when you have every reason to be proud. Listen to the people you've trained yourself to ignore: the janitor, the waitress, the nervous woman praying in the seat next to you. You never ever know the silent battles people are fighting, or the incredible strength they carry hidden deep inside them." She gave him a small, sad smile. "Your fear of flying, it comes from a place of grief, doesn't it? From a loss you couldn't control. You've tried to build a world where you can never be hurt like that again. But all you've done is build a prison. The only way out isn't to control the world, Arthur. It's to learn to serve the people in it. That's freedom. That's real power." With a final warm nod, she tucked his card into her pocket and turned to join another group of passengers, a family with a small crying child who needed her calm presence. Arthur Vance stood alone in the middle of the Gander Airport terminal, the echo of her words resounding in the hollow space inside him. He was grounded in more ways than one. His flight to London had ended here, in this small, unassuming town in the middle of the North Atlantic. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt that a much longer, more difficult, and infinitely more meaningful journey was just beginning. Arthur remained rooted to the spot long after Grace had walked away, her words hanging in the air like a final immutable judgment on the man he had been. The chaotic symphony of the terminal, the crying children, the urgent announcements, the overlapping buzz of 100 phone calls slowly returned to his awareness. He looked down at his own hands, half expecting to see them differently. They were the same hands that signed multi-billion-dollar contracts, that dismissed underlings with a flick of the wrist, that had gripped the armrest in sheer, unadulterated terror. Yet something felt irrevocably changed. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a persistent, demanding buzz. He knew without looking it was Mark, his ever-efficient, perpetually stressed chief of staff. Before Arthur would have answered with a roar, demanding why his private jet wasn't already on its way, excoriating the airline for their incompetence and setting in motion a logistical ballet to extract him from this inconvenient purgatory. He pulled the phone out, saw Mark's name, and took a breath. He answered, but the voice that came out was not his own. It was quieter, weary, devoid of its usual hard metallic edge. "Mark," he said. "Mr. Vance." "Thank God. Are you all right, sir?" "The news is all over an emergency landing. I've been trying to charter a flight out of St. John's, but the weather is still an issue. I'm on with the Gander FBO. Now we can have a car for you in 30 minutes. "Stop," Arthur said the single word, cutting through Mark's frantic planning. "Just stop. Cancel it all." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "So cancel what?" "The car. The charter. Everything, Mark. The meetings in London. The conference call tomorrow. clear my schedule for the rest of the week. But the Henderson merger, sir. The final signatory meeting is in 2 days. It's worth... It doesn't matter, Arthur said, and the truth of the statement settled into his bones. None of it matters right now. Just handle it. And Mark, yes, sir. Go home. Be with your family. He ended the call before his bewildered assistant could reply. He slid the phone back into his pocket, feeling as though he had just shed a heavy, suffocating skin. Across the room, he saw an elderly woman fumbling with her carry-on bag. Her coffee cup, perched precariously on top, tipped over, splashing a brown stain across the floor and her coat. She let out a small, frustrated sigh, her shoulders slumping in defeat. In his previous life, Arthur wouldn't have noticed her. She would have been part of the scenery. Now he walked over. He didn't say a word, simply grabbing a handful of napkins from a nearby dispenser. He knelt an act, his tailored suit protested, and began sopping up the spill on the floor. The woman stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, you don't have to," she started. "It's no trouble," Arthur said, his voice low. He helped her dab the stain on her coat, and then easily lifted her heavy bag, placing it securely on a nearby chair. "Well, thank you, dear," she said, patting his arm with a wrinkled hand. "You're a very kind young man." Kind. The word struck him with more force than any insult ever had. He simply nodded, a lump forming in his throat, and retreated to the edge of the room, his heart pounding with a strange new emotion. It wasn't the thrill of a successful deal or the adrenaline of a corporate battle. It was something quieter, warmer. It was the feeling of being useful. He looked for Grace one last time, and saw her sitting on the floor with the family she had gone to help, patiently showing their small, teary-eyed daughter how to fold a napkin into the shape of a swan. She wasn't saving the world. She was just making one small corner of it a little less frightening. And for the first time, Arthur Vance understood that perhaps they were the same thing. The story of Grace Holloway and Arthur Vance on that terrifying flight across the Atlantic is a powerful reminder of a truth we too often forget. We see the world not as it is, but as we are. Arthur, blinded by his own arrogance and fear, saw weakness in Grace's quiet faith. He couldn't have been more wrong. True strength isn't about loud voices, expensive suits, or the illusion of control. It's found in compassion, in service, and in the courage to face our own fears with grace. Arthur's hard karma wasn't some supernatural punishment. It was the natural, humbling consequence of his own worldview colliding with a reality he couldn't bully or buy his way out of. He was forced to witness the very strength he mocked become the thing that saved him and everyone around him. If this story touched you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that explore the moments that change us forever. Thank you for listening.